Hello, everyone, and welcome back to part 2 of Narratology versus Ludology. So we were talking about the narrative myth in the holodeck.
Okay, so I think, we were talking about the unpredictability of the actions. I think we perhaps were at the next slide, talking about the psychology of it. Yeah, we were talking about the psychological strain that VR has on the player, and I don't know if, for our first part, if any of you guys caught what I was saying earlier, which is that currently there's a study on how Oculus Rift has an effect on players who are playing horror games. A lot of them refuse to play horror games with Oculus Rift on because they felt like they were actually in mortal danger, simply because they felt so immersed in the game, they felt like they were actually being stabbed or being harmed by entities in the game. So what Ryan said here with the optimism that Murray talked about in terms of that holodeck metaphor really is apt here, because we do need to also consider if there are any kind of side effects to putting someone in a holodeck. Also, the idea that holodeck give us infinite narratives, that in itself is scary for Ryan, because of the idea that not all narratives are positive. Narrative is just a way of thinking about problem solving, right? Part of the whole point of talking about narrative is to problem solve. So for her to say that there's infinite ways to discuss a narrative is actually not good on someone who's fully immersed in that virtual environment. So that's one of the arguments that she brought out. So if we can go next. Yeah, thank you. So she also discussed this idea of the adaptation. So switching from reality to virtual reality, how well your mental state adapts to each condition. Because she uses an example where she discusses where the virtual reality has become so attractive that you don't really want to abandon it, that you start to think that that's reality versus your actual reality. So she offers Catherine Janeway from Star Trek as an example of someone who experienced mental pain when she has to delete her virtual lover when her virtual life interfered with fulfilling duties in her physical life. Now, I'm relying on some fellow Trekkies here. Do you guys remember the episode?
You know, I don't remember that particular
episode.
No. But I can picture it. Yeah, I don't think I saw that particular episode.
And the thing about it is that's not the most popular Star Trek. So,
no,
you know, so Voyager isn't. Now, I remember an episode in Voyager where Janeway, she decided to stop playing it as a game because what it was her lover. She started, like, he snored, and she was like, "Computer, stop snoring. You know, computer, make him taller. You know, computer, do this." And she stopped because it wasn't. But I don't remember her having to delete.
Well, what's kind of funny is Janeway wasn't a very emotional character.
Yeah.
So it's kind of funny.
So maybe it's a cathartic. Maybe it's a commentary, right? On she's having a cathartic moment when she was in the holodeck, so she would be able to be emotional, maybe.
But I mean, there's things that and just because of somebody who uses virtual worlds and games, there's things like when we bring people into Second Life, usually for like the first couple times, that they do react physically to their avatar falling, but after a while they adjust to it. But I think just about everybody who's been, you know, in a virtual world or deals with bringing people into virtual worlds and showing them how to use them has had the experience or seen the experience of somebody acting as if it was happening to the actual person. No, I mean, so that's not really that's not so far-fetched, but people seem to adapt to that, and there's some people who are immersed quicker than other people.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. Did you? We talked about this, and I was just thinking that I just watched a video a couple months ago, where it was a prank. It was a really mean prank. They strapped on the Oculus Rift on an old man, and it was also like what you were talking about. It was a virtual reality where the old man felt like he was falling, like the earth fell off and he was falling. And you see in the video, the old man was screaming for his life, and he fell on the ground and almost hurt himself, because he couldn't tell that was, at that moment he was so immersed that he was screaming his head off, and it was very mean prank. So I was just thinking about that.
And I guess what I'm saying is that I've seen in virtual worlds that people adapt. People adapt so that the same thing won't feel as immersive if they do it a certain number of times.
So it's repetition, right? It's repetition that you adapt to, and you eventually do, right?
Yeah, and I will have to say that it's considered a very good, game if flying feels immersive to you.
Right. Exactly. So I'm going to go to that next slide. Yeah, I think this is going to be our last slide, I believe. Yeah. So she talks more about the danger. She doesn't scare people, okay? So she said, there's danger with interacting with alternative plots. So here's the little quote. So interactors would have to be out of their mind, literally and metaphorically, to want to submit themselves to the fate of a heroine who commits suicide as a result of a love affair turned bad, like Emma Bovary or Anna Karenina. Any attempt to turn empathy, which relied on mental simulation, into first-person, genuinely felt emotion, would in the vast majority of cases trespass the fragile boundary that separates pleasure from pain. So she is saying, well, geez, VR can also give us pain. That's something to consider. But maybe for the previous example that you have offered us, where you experiment with the students, maybe that was your goal, is to let them feel some pain.
Well, actually, our goal was to make them feel something. Yeah, it's right, because it was the Tibetan Book of the Dead. I mean, it was dealing with the peaceful deities and the wrathful deities, and actually, the choosing where you would be reborn. That whole portion of it, and we made modifications, but it was. We had a lot of interesting reactions when it came to the essays, and it was funny. We did have exaggerations when it came to, well, I could hear this, or I saw that, and we're like, we didn't have that in there, in the essays and things like that. But it could just been students embellishing.
Mm-hmm.
But
yeah. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I guess the thing, it seems like her writing, she does take it to a bit of an extreme, and I'd have to say people who build in virtual environments at this point in time might find her taking it to an extreme that's not possible yet.
Well, her essay is quite famous because she defined narrativity. In terms of the other argument, yeah, she does, good academics make, passionate arguments. So there's always going to be that. But I think when we read this particular article, I think what's wonderful is that she defined narrativity to such extent. And she clearly explained what's the difference between narrativity, and the level between representation and actual interpretation. And she talks about the idea that when we are talking about narrative representation, that also, in terms of an interactive hypertext or something like the holodeck metaphor, the reader or the interactor is the one that's creating the narrative representation based on their interpretation. So she talks about the idea that the technology needs to be there to make that happen so it feels more immersive. But again, right now for her, when she wrote this article, she didn't think it's possible. But looking at what's happening with VR, it's starting to look more and more like it's possible. Some of the things that she's talking about here. Now, if Chris doesn't mind, what I would like to do is to go back to the article by Ryan. And it's on the site. It's on our week 2. And I couldn't put all the stuff because this article is very long. But I just kind of want to scroll through a few more of the concepts in the article. And by the way, here's the link if you need it. Okay. Yep. There you go. There you go. Yep. There's the article. Now I'm scrolling down slightly, and if you want to zoom in for us, that'd be great. If you can zoom in a little bit. I'm actually at the part where she's talking about internal and external interactivity. So she's responding to Aspen Erseth on his topology of user functions and perspective in cybertext. So he attempted in his book Cybertext to create a topology of exactly what happens with a narrative in terms of in a game, okay? So, or interactive fiction, to be more specific. And she disagrees on certain parts, but here's her classification, okay? So first she talks about internal versus external interactivity. So very simply, internal is when you take on a character and you're in the game itself. So you're internal and you're interacting with that fictional environment. Okay, so the external is when you have a godlike view of what's happening in the game. So one of the games we can think of, for example, Sin City. Your physical body is not exactly inside the game, but you're godlike. You control what's happening in the game. So that's how she distinguishes internal versus external. This is a little different than Erseth, who says that external, in his sense, is when you are playing a character. You're still inside the game, but you control other people's lives. So there's a physical representation of you or virtual representation of you in the game, and that's what he means by external. For her is when the body is not even in the game. That's external interactivity. Okay. Other terms here: exploratory versus ontological. So her explanation of exploratory is a narrative type where you're free, what she said there. In the exploratory mode, the user is free to move around the database, but this activity does not make history, nor does it alter the plot. The user has no impact on the destiny of the virtual world. So in this sense, it's related to, because you're still usually as the first person view, okay, and you're just exploring. So that sounds like, when you do not alter the plot at all. Sometimes you can say Minecraft falls under that exploratory, right? Because you're moving around and you're kind of generating some kind of meaning, but it doesn't have to follow a specific plot, nor does the game have to make you follow a certain kind of plot. Then the second category that she talked about is ontological, which is basically what exists. That's what she's talking about. But let me see here what she says. Number 2. Okay. So and she's talking about Erseth again. Okay. So she says, in his own taxonomy, Erseth comes up with 2 roughly similar categories, exploratory and configurative. But these 2 concepts are part of a longer list of user functions that also comprises interpretive and textonic. The latter, the ability to add permanent elements to the text. I see no point in regarding interpretive as a distinctive user function, since interpretation is involved in all intelligent text handling. Within the present framework, moreover, it is not necessary to distinguish textonic from ontological, since the ability to add permanent components to the text presupposes a demiurgic power to co-create the virtual world. So ontological is creating that world. But why she is talking about these distinction is because she says that when you generate a narrative, the user has to be involved, especially when you're talking about digital media. The user, when they interpret the text or the experience, they generate a narrative. And that's why she's making a distinction on how a user will function based on whether they're in exploratory mode or if they're in ontological mode. Okay? And then next, let's see here. Okay. Yeah, this is quite a bit. So I think I'm going to leave this part for you guys to explore unless you have questions about this section. She just offered lots of explanation of what the internal exploratory, internal ontological feels like. So she came up with 4 categories and explained to you what kind of user interaction is involved in that. Okay, but finally, basically, she's arguing that narrativity, when we talk about narrativity, it is not medium specific. And if you are going to transfer narrativity, right, if you're going to express narrativity to through digital media, you have to consider the medium itself, the effect of the medium on the narrative. Okay, so that's her big argument there. Now, if we go back to other texts, so we have 4 other ones, big ones here. The second one is from Gonzalo Frasca, and it's called Ludology Meets Narratology, Similitude and Differences Between Video Games and Narratives. Okay, so what exactly is this debate? I'll just give you guys a bit of preface, okay? So the debate right now, well, back in the day, this debate has actually diffused. But the debate was, can you actually interpret video games as literature, as text, and use pre-existing literary theory to analyze text? So for example, a literature teacher might be analyzing the metaphors in a game, or using literary devices to explain what's happening in the game. Now, a ludologist will say you can't do that. A game is not a narrative. There are certain elements that makes it similar to narrative, but it has nothing to do with narrative. A narrative is a secondary element that we add on to the game. So a ludologist would say, well, look, we designed the game using rules and mechanics, okay? And then in order to make the player feel like they're progressing through the game, we add the narrative as a second layer to the actual rules and mechanics. So basically the ludologist says, look, you can't just use literary theory or whatever theory you want to apply and think that you can analyze video games that way, okay? And he says, and great, and Chris just got to a really good section there, the need for a ludology. So I'm going to read a little bit there. It says there, Frasca says, the term narratology had to be invented to unify the works that scholars from different disciplines were doing about narrative. Okay, so narrative is not just, literature people owns it, or semiotics owns it. Everyone's kind of doing their thing about narrative. The research about games and play is in a similar situation. The topics have been broadly studied from different disciplines, for example, psychology, anthropology, economy, and sociology. However, these studies are generally independent, focusing on small characteristics without looking for bigger patterns of understanding. So, what are the ludologists calling us to do? Ludology is a form of formalism. So formalism is looking at the structure and the rule of the thing without imposing, literary interpretation to the thing. So you actually have to look at the structure of the game, like what kind of rules are there, what objects, what existence are in the game, rather than talking about how does the setting influence the game, how does the character development influence the game. A ludologist will say, we're not going to do that. That's irrelevant to what you're supposed to do when you do a ludological study, okay? So also under play and game, so you can go down a little bit for me there, Chris. Slightly, yeah. So under play and game, I like the definition. This kind of tethers to what we have done in week 1, okay? So he says, here's the traditional meaning of play and game. The dictionary defines play as what is done for amusement, recreation, the playing of a game, matter of playing, turn or move in a game, contrasted with work, have fun, pretend for fun to be something, to do something, okay? That's from Hornsby, but obviously you guys can see the influence from Huizinga, talking about playing for fun, right? So that's association. And then the second definition is game as a form of play. So it's a secondary element. So play comes before game. It's a form of play, especially with rules. So it's a play that's confined by rules, okay? So that's what you call a game. And he says, let's see here. If we go down a tiny bit there, so he says, if both play and game have rules, which is the main difference between them, okay? Because Huizinga also says there are rules with play. So this is his argument. And later on, there's other theorists that say, no, the rules belong to games. So there's a big debate there, right? So he says that the only author that gives a hint is philosopher André Lalonde. He proposes two different meanings when he defines jeu in his Dictionnaire philosophique in 1928. Even though he does not explicitly refers to game in play, and in French, there's just one word that refers to both of those terms. He differentiates them not because of their rules, but by their result. And I love this definition. Games have a result. They define a winner and a loser. Plays do not. Okay? So before I go further, what do you guys think about that definition there? Do you agree with that?
Well, I personally would want them to reunite because I hate this division in the principles and the subjects of study. Because I mean, it depends on what we're talking about. If we're talking about games from the 80s compared to games now, games have evolved to where you had Pong, and now we have Elder Scrolls, where the Skyrim was totally written first, and they applied game mechanics because they just reused their engine. So I mean,
right.
It depends on what we're talking about.
I mean, for me, this is fodder, okay? And the reason why is sandbox games, right? Sandbox games a lot of times are much more about play than the win and loss scenario. And and for that reason, I kind of like breaking it out.
Right.
So for me, I like breaking it out so that people get an idea of what what Minecraft is. Sure, you can build a game in there, and there can be a win and a loss, and the creepers can get you and things like that. But I like it because this could help me explain a sandbox genre.
Right.
So that's why I like it. Okay. I mean, 3 years from now I might hate it, but today it's useful for me.
I think, I think this is, if you guys can see an analogy to Ryan's article when she talks about what exactly is narrative and narrativity, and part of the condition of narrativity, the result is discourse, right? I seem to think that play is equivalent to, well, I shouldn't say equivalent, but similar, right, to narrative as a sign. So it's an idea. It's supposed to signify something. So it's just a sign. It doesn't have anything by itself. And then game is basically the signifier of the idea that you're trying to express. So game would be kind of like novels and poems that are already actualized in form, whereas for game scholars, play doesn't have form yet. But Huizinga talks about, even though it doesn't have form, the play acts is actually have rules. So in his sense, when he say play acts, it's closer to game, but he didn't want to go there. So later on, people picked him apart and go, what do you mean by play act and play force? Okay, but yeah, I think this distinction helps us explain these things, because not every play has to have winner and loser. And I wonder, when you're saying sandbox game, because there's that confusion of terms, right? Because it's a sandbox game, but you say you can play in that sandbox. I wonder what rules are governing that.
Well, yeah, exactly. And for me, we're calling it a sandbox game, but it looks pretty much like sandbox virtual world to me. But we're explaining it using that term.
Mm-hmm. Right. Now, just on the same page there, he also talked about paideia. Okay, paideia it means the prodigality of physical or mental activity which has no immediate useful objective, nor defined objective, and whose only reason to be is based in the pleasure experimented by the player. So he decided that they're going to use ludus, because ludus is a type of paideia defined as, quote, activity organized under a system of rules that defines a victory or a defeat, a gain or a loss. So for game scholars, when you say ludology and ludus, it's more akin to when you're talking about a game, where you design board games or video games. That's the term that they're going to use. Okay, paideia also means play, but ludus is closer, because we're talking about a type of play that actually has rules within it. Okay, so then in this article, I'm not going to go through all of this because it's, again, pretty hefty here. But he talks about the plot structure or sequential narrative sequences in play, okay? Because when you play in a game, there are certain rules you have to follow. Narrative, if you talk about sequence or plot, those are also similar to rules. So he talks about them in similarities, but he also later on discussed the idea that you have other games where you don't really have to have narrative in order to be a game. So a lot of ludologists would talk about, for example, Tetris. Okay, you can't really insist on saying, yeah, there's a story to Tetris. I mean, you can say it's secondary, but when you're playing the game, it's not as if you can actually understand a plot or story just by playing Tetris. Can you guys think of any pure ludological games which is just rule without much narrative?
Grid just typed in something. I don't know if she wants to go on mic.
I'm kind of liking this distinction between play and games because I was kind of struggling with that. And I think the idea that you can play, but it doesn't have to be a game. I mean, a kid sits in a sandbox and plays. They can play by themselves. They're building things. They're, whatever it is that they're playing and feeling and learning, but they're not in any kind of a competition. It's not a win-lose situation, but they are playing. It is playful.
Right.
So perhaps that's considered, kind of free play, whereas again, there is a purpose. And maybe the win-lose might be a little strong, but there is a purpose. And even if you're playing a computer, or if you're playing other people, obviously, but there's a winner or a loser. So maybe those are, game is what makes the distinction between how you play, perhaps.
Yeah. And I'm just thinking in the back of my mind other game examples that's purely ludological or rule-based rather than narrative-based. So, I mean, the earliest example we can think of Pong, right?
Yeah, Pong would be good. Pac-Man. Jerry's saying track and field.
You know what? Pac-Man is a really good example, Chris, because Pac-Man, some people argue, oh yeah, there's a narrative to it because of those cutscenes, right?
Yeah.
But a ludologist would say, well, look, the game itself doesn't have a narrative. I mean, they added in the cutscenes to give you a sense of narrative, but if you insist that the game, which you're supposed to look at the formula structure of the game, and you said that there's a narrative, you're forcing an interpretation that's not there. That's what they're fighting against, I think. But yeah, that's a pretty good example.
For more current ludological games, I mean, let's go to the mobile game market. Candy Crush is very popular, but it's rule-based puzzle matching.
Right.
Any of the wall puzzle games on your phones, I mean, they're very highly addicting, highly play-worthy, and people donate lots of time to them, but I mean, they don't really have a narrative.
Well, I mean, I'm like thinking about that. I'm like, Fruit Ninja. No, I subscribe a narrative to Fruit Ninja. Okay, I do.
You create your own.
Yeah, I've created my own narrative when it comes to Fruit Ninja. Okay. And if you go on YouTube, you'll see some reenactments of Fruit Ninja too, the videos. So yeah.
And although these authors are relatively recent, I can't help but think that, like what Blue said about evolution, that there is an evolution, and perhaps how we thought of it in its primal way of game and play, technology does change things up. It's changed things up tremendously. Businesses aren't in business anymore. Jobs don't exist anymore because of what technology has done. The entertainment business is being turned on its head. Even the publishing, the book publishing business, the movie business, entertainment business, television, it's
Right.
all been changed around because of this. So maybe there is an evolution. And I mean, I respect these authors and their research, but they are pretty recent. But I still think there might be something that they didn't think of. Even
Yeah, and that's the thing with the holodeck one. It's just surprising. I mean, let me go back and check dates and things like that. But a number of us who have been involved with the virtual environments have seen things where people have gotten scared, or there's been rehabilitation because of things being done in virtual environments, and so it's very interesting to have that argument. And like my comment earlier, which was about, well, people assume that you're in a virtual space, so anything can be designed. No, not everything can be designed.
Right. And I wanted to respond to Grid's comment there, because talking about timeliness of arguments. Ludology is actually a way to interpret something. So basically, a ludologist tells you to just look at the form of the game and the rule of the game. So it's not just saying that all games only have rules and all games only have these formalist structures. They're just saying that do a ludological study of the game, because they insist that if you want to be a successful game designer, you really need to break down a game and look at individual parts, like what mechanics are employed. How do the particular mechanic work together to make the game fun? So it's actually a way.
Yeah, you said fun, because all I'm thinking about is because you have to figure out what makes it engaging or fun, or what brings what brings people back. And a lot of times it's not reading the quest line card that you've gotten for a second time. That's not what's bringing people back to play it a second time.
I can't help but think also the book that we're reading in the other track for the win. There's just so many crossovers from that track to this track, and I'm making all these connections. I don't know if they're right or not, but I'm making the connections anyway. But of course, one of the thoughts that came to me is, when does a game become work, and is that possible? Because these people in the book, they are playing a game, but it's work, and they're getting beat up physically. Beat up for what they're doing, and they're and it's this cause that they have, and it's becoming much more than a game. And then of course I keep going back, well, isn't everything a game? And anyway, it's just doing strange things to my head, because I don't know what, is it real, is it not real, is it a game, is life a game, are we playing all the time? And when, like playing the game, how often do we use that term in the workplace? He knows how to play the game. You got to play the game to get ahead, right? I mean, we can think of so many phrases with the word game, but I guess game in its purest sense is kind of what this is a description of and a definition of.
Yeah, you're not the only one confused about these things. I've heard the theories.
That's the thing about it. Think of us. A lot of us work online.
Right. I want to bring back, though, just to kind of say, I really do like Lalonde's. I mean, it's very basic, but I think it helps us a little bit when you go, what? Are they the same thing? And, in philosophy, we always have to say you must define your terms, otherwise you're just talking to yourself and no one's going to agree with you. So I do like the fact that we're really clearly distinguishing, because they are different. And I think under there, when I say that game, Lalonde's explanation of what a game is it have the win-loss state, right? Whereas the play is just play. I think that for now might be easy for us to kind of consider these issues. But when you say, for example, at work, I play a game, you're already saying that the play that's inside a game. It's not play for play's sake. Right?
Well, just Blue, how do you feel about that cloak you're going for in World of Warcraft? Is that work or is that play?
I feel like it's woke, but I feel like I must achieve it because it's a status symbol. So I mean, it's the metagame of trying to match the part of, am I a level 90 that's the lazy one, or am I level 90 that's taking it seriously? And in which case, I've taken the game on its head and saying the game is designed to have fun, but when I'm making it all this serious accusations, spending hours and stuff, it's not a game anymore sometimes. And I mean, it really is coming down to how the players are playing. And I mean, over the years, games have evolved, but that's because the audience has evolved. And I mean, now they're catering to that free play that Grid was talking about, where when you're in Minecraft, you have the option of you have winning or losing, but I mean, you have the option of creating your own things, whether it's a game, whether it's a structure. But I mean, other games are having that model too, where it's not just you have a game and you go from A to B. You have all these quests, you have all these other facets within the metagame of communicating through people, whether you're looking for social involvement or you're looking for complete want to have that high social status. I mean, a game has so many multiple facets that I think like sometimes I dislike and I disavow how mobile gaming is because it lacks the narrative, or they are very skimpy on the narrative. But sometimes I think it's because of the rules that it's returning to like a simplicity of what game used to be. Like I know when we were talking about board games, I mean Monopoly has this is the money. Whoever wins, you have to make everyone else broke. Well, I know in our family we like to change the rules, or we like to change how things are done, especially with board games. Or like when people play tag, they have different versions of tag. You have freeze tag, you have King of the Hill tag, like a bunch of different kinds of tags, but tag is essentially running around and tagging someone. But I mean, that changing of the game, I think the people that are playing have changed the rules of the game, not just because the producers of EA games or Bethesda or any of the other big game corporations are putting labels on or defining rules in the game book. Like you get a game, you open it, you get the disc, and you get the game info packet. You read the game info packet, tells you how to play the game, but that info packet is useless if they just want to go around Elder Scrolls collecting brooms or just having fun. It's essentially just doing what you want to do. It's that experimentation. And you were talking previously about that the virtual reality and how they were using that as a form of simulation and trying to experiment with different experiences. But I mean, that realism that people were damaging themselves mentally, or they were becoming really scarce because they were too immersed. But I mean, that has a purpose too, whether you're training yourself to be more willfully standing if you're doing in the middle of a zombie horde. Who's to say that zombies aren't going to happen? How will you react? Will you let them attack you? Will you stand your ground? And it's like one of the other parallels was not just like the holodeck, but in X-Men they have this thing called a danger room where it creates hard light models of everything, and you can interact with everything. Like it runs different scenarios and different experiences so that you can mentally prepare yourself for actually being in battle or different experiences that you're undertaking. So I mean, it really is about what they're doing.
Okay, and I think this one at least got us thinking.
Yeah, I think this one really got us thinking, and it's also very interesting to read what the game scholars have to say when you're a gamer yourself, or you've been designing games or working in immersive spaces and doing things there. Because when you start reading what the scholars have to say, and you start looking at it and going, I think there needs to be a certain bit of research being done in this kind of neglected area. And I think I think that kind of helps us along.
Well, that's what you have to contribute. Okay.
I know. Well,
boy. Yeah. And I wanted to maybe a couple more. I don't know. Are we okay on time? Maybe getting close.
We're getting a little close.
Yeah, we're getting close. So, Chris, do you mind clicking on Jasper Jules, and then I'll quit? I got slang too many. I know it's my fault. But when you say a debate, you know, I feel that it's my responsibility to make sure that we present both sides really well so you guys understand what's going on. But if you can, Chris, if you can go down to where it says the problem of translation, Jasper Jewell has been accused of saying that he hates narrative, or he thinks that in ludological arguments or study that narrative does not belong. But in this paper, if you read this paper, he actually talks extensively of what exactly is narrative and what exactly when games are not, and he does a really excellent job. So I'll read a tiny bit here. He says, the problem of translation. So when you're talking about from transmitting narrative into a video game, that's what he's talking about, okay? I will now use some narrative theory in an operation for which it was not intended. The basic problem of the narrative is the fact that a narrative can never be viewed independently on sick. We can never see the story itself. We can only see it through another medium like oral storytelling, novels, and movies. The classical argument for the existence of narratives is then the fact that a story can be translated from one medium to another. And here's the quote. This transposability of the story is the strongest reason for arguing that narratives are indeed structures independent of any medium. So a narratologist would say, narratives do not have to rely on medium in order to survive. Okay, it's a mental concept. Correspondingly, Peter Brooks says, narrative may be a special ability or competence that, when masters, allows us to summarize and retransmit narrative in other words and other languages, to transfer them into other media while remaining recognizably faithful to the original narrative structure and message. And this may seem somewhat unproblematic. We can never get everything between media, but at least some things seem to be transported from medium to medium. A recounting of Pride and Prejudice movie will be recognizable to somebody who has read the book. Now, I'm not going to read the rest of this part, but when he starts talking about, let me just show you how it doesn't translate. This is a similar argument with Ryan, who is seen as a narratologist or a narrativist, okay? And people put Jewel on the side of ludologists. And actually, when you look at their writing, they actually are talking about very similar things, but they're talking slip past each other. Some ludologists doesn't quite understand what narrativism is, right? And some narrativist doesn't really understand what they mean by studying the game in a formalist sense. So I would recommend reading this one just to get a more in-depth view on what is the problem with narrative and game and why you can't say that they're the same thing. Okay. And lastly, on our page, I gave you guys a cheat video. So if you guys hate reading all this stuff, there is a cheat video.
We saw it.
You can watch it. It's very simplistic. It's 6 minutes, 42 seconds. Just what I show to my students, when they go, my brain hurts. It's a very easy explanation. Certainly does not encompass all the stuff I talked about today because, the debate's very complicated. Also, if you look at the site the slides where it says the last word on ludology versus narratology, this one is wonderful because Janet H. Murray documents the debate between Aspen Urseth and, who's the other person? All of a sudden, Urseth, and let's see here. Yeah, somehow I'm not remembering the name. Yeah, but Henry Jenkins. I'm sorry.
Oh, Jenkins, come on.
Yeah, this is a very famous debate. Very famous debate. But Urseth, I know, I'm sorry. I'm kind of tired today. So Urseth is famous because he's the one that invented the term ergodic literature. We're not going to go too much into it, but ergodic literature is related to interactive fiction, and this is why he created, a topology talking about how players interact in interactive fiction and how do you make different kind of plots with that kind of structure. And they had a really, heated debate, and, at the end they made up, but, So if you want to see the slide, this slide corresponds to the reading. It really will help you understand what the heck is the problem here. But at the end, most people think of narratology as ludology, that they're actually more closely associated than what the theorists are trying to say. Okay, and I think that's on mine. I'm going to leave it alone. I know I said a lot of stuff today already.
Okay, so you ready for the your wrap up now?
Yep.
Okay. So we'll get Chris to do the close, of course.
Oh.
Or Blue could do it. I mean.
No. It's like we're done already. I want to keep going.
I'll be like, well, thank you everyone for watching, and we'll see you in the discussion community. And Well, let's see. I guess in the immortal words of John McLaughlin, bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Oh.